Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're going to do a political roundup today with Andrew Perez, who is a political journalist. He's a political commentator. He's a political activist, most recently with the Liberal Party in Ontario in their boardroom, their communications area. He's a writer. He's written in numerous different periodicals. And he's a really nice, intelligent, smart guy. And so we're going to talk about a bunch of different things. We're going to talk about Erin O'Toole and an interview that he's recently done that really re-litigated the last federal election. We're going to talk about what's going on a little bit in Quebec with the win by the CAQ, the CAQ. We're going to talk a little bit about affordability and maybe some other issues that come up. So Andrew Perez, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
I'm great. Great to be on your show again, Brian.
Thank you for coming on. So let's start with Erin O'Toole. You wanted to tell me about he's sort of re-arguing, relitigating what happened. Tell me what he said.
Yeah, so I found this very interesting. Not so much what he said, but the fact that a mere 7 months following his ouster, that he's now openly relitigating really the last federal election. And so he granted about a 25-minute interview with the National Post, John Ivison, about a week ago. And it's a really interesting discussion. I encourage your viewers to listen to it. But he essentially says that had it not been for the COVID-19 pandemic and the divisive politics that the Prime Minister played around that in the campaign, even, though he argued the Prime Minister triggered that election because he thought he could win on COVID and win on his record in terms of the supports that the federal government delivered to businesses and families and individuals. But he argues that had it not been for the pandemic and the politics that the Prime Minister and the Liberal Party played around that he would have won that election. He actually says, and I'm not convinced this is the case, but he claims that up until 2 days before Election Day, the Conservatives were still leading in seat count. Of course, they did win the popular vote,
which is something that a lot of people forget. They actually won more votes.
Yes, so they won the popular vote by 1 or 2%, as they also did in 2019 under leader Andrew Scheer. So that was kind of a constant, but he claims that up until about a couple days before E-Day, they were actually set to win more seats. Now, I'm not sure that's the case. I mean, it's certainly, if that had transpired, it would have been a slim minority government. I don't believe they had the seat count in the Greater Toronto Area, or for that matter in Quebec, to form a majority. That's a year ago now, that campaign. But it's very clear in my mind that they did not have the seat count across the country to form a majority. So we might be arguing around a few seats here. But I find it interesting that he's gone public. I mean, granted, this was an interview on nationalpost.com, so not necessarily an interview on CBC News, but because I think, while he makes some good points, and it's certainly debatable, I think it's early for him to be coming out of the woodwork to make these comments. I think that, as a leader that was ousted unceremoniously by his caucus, over 50% of the caucus voted against his leadership last February through the Reform Act, which is a piece of legislation that the Conservative caucus endorsed and allows them to vote non-confidence essentially in a leader. So the way in which he was ousted was unprecedented, very public, and must have been very difficult on Mr. O'Toole and his family. He was leader for less than 2 years, only about a year and a half. So it was a short reign for Mr. O'Toole, and the Conservative Party had the last couple elections have only given their leaders one election to prove their mettle. Similarly, Andrew Scheer was ousted, not in the exact same fashion, but he was essentially shown the door within a couple months of the 2019 election. He only had, he wasn't able to win, and so he was shown the door, and Mr. O'Toole, experienced the same fate. So, if you have follow-up questions, but we have examples, plenty of examples of leaders who were ousted and remained in politics. Joe Clark would be an excellent example of.
Well, in the NDP, you got 2 or 3 kicks at the can.
Yeah. But with Joe Clark, he was both leader and prime minister, and opted to remain in politics and became an incredibly influential and effective minister, I would argue, in the Brian Mulroney government as Minister of External Affairs, which is essentially now Foreign Affairs, but also playing a key role on the Charlottetown Accord in the early 90s. You have Stockwell Day, who was also ousted unceremoniously in the early 2000s, replaced by Stephen Harper. And to his credit, he went on to become a senior minister in the Harper government. And we now see Andrew Scheer, I think, looking to plot a similar path forward. He was ousted 3 years ago now, but he's now been appointed as House Leader on Pierre Poilievre's leadership team. He was a strong supporter of Mr. Poilievre throughout the leadership campaign. He's clearly not going anywhere. He's clearly angling to be a senior minister in a Poilievre government. So these examples demonstrate that for those leaders that do fail and that are essentially ousted, there can be a path forward. There can be a respectable political career ahead for those essentially failed leaders. And so it'll be interesting to see what Mr. O'Toole plans on that front. He noted in the interview that he specifically asked Mr. Poilievre to not include him in the opposition shadow cabinet critic lineup, which has yet to be announced. But he said that he does not want to be a distraction for the leader. He will advise and provide his best counsel to the leader privately over the coming years in the lead up to the next election. But he's not looking for a public role. He's certainly not looking for the media to quote him and maybe quote him as contradicting what the new leader is saying. And so I think that's all well and good, but perhaps in my view a bit early to be coming out to relitigate the last federal election. So
we're going to talk about Pierre Poilievre and his politics and positioning a little later on, but just off the top, the way I saw it is that he was trying to justify his left turn or his center turn, and if Poilievre is a substantial right turn for the Conservative Party and it doesn't work, then by reminding people that he won the popular vote, that he was close to winning, might give him a second crack at the can, second hit at the can. Anyway, we're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes with Andrew Perez, a political junkie, a political commentator, an author of numerous different political pieces in several different periodicals, and a smart guy. Stay tuned, everybody. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Our guest tonight is Andrew Perez. He is a political commentator, a political activist. He most recently was involved in the war room, the communications area for the Ontario Liberal Party. He's written numerous different pieces in different periodicals, and he's a little bit of a historian. As I've chatted with him over the last couple of months, he knows a lot about politics in the past and present. And we're talking right now about Erin O'Toole, the former leader of the Conservative Party of Canada. Did a recent interview and said that he got close to winning, and he didn't win for 3 reasons. Andrew, what were those 3 reasons that he stated that he didn't win?
Right. So he kind of anchored his argument in the COVID-19 pandemic and the politics that he argues the Prime Minister played around that. The 3 specific issues that he cited, and I think they are compelling. I think there is some truth to this. He cited climate change, gun control, and vaccine mandates, and I can get into flesh a bit of each of those out. On climate change, I'm in full agreement with him. He argues that in the Greater Toronto Area, in the province of Quebec, having a robust and credible climate change plan is absolutely paramount, and that you can't form government in this day and age without one. And to his credit, O'Toole recognized that early on in his leadership. In March 2021, so a few months ahead of the last federal election, he rolled out a carbon pricing plan. And, it received a lot of coverage, media coverage. People criticized it, But at the end of the day, it was a credible plan. O'Toole argues it wasn't a carbon tax, that it was carbon pricing. And I mean, you can have an academic debate about that, but it was a carbon pricing plan. And that was a first for the Conservative Party. And, I think there were definite issues within the caucus. The caucus was not consulted on the plan. Many of them were taken by surprise. Apparently, many of them found out about the plan in the media as opposed to really receiving a briefing ahead of time. So I think in terms of how it was rolled out in the consultations that were done within the party and the caucus, I think there were some real challenges there. But the fact is, he did roll out a plan, and in the last federal election, every major federal party was in support of carbon pricing. And so he argued that in spite of that, there were still questions around the Conservative Party's commitment to fighting climate change. And he says, he's got children age, 10, 12, and that, they learn about these issues in school, and they raise these issues with, like, his own daughter has raised climate change with him. And he says, simply, being able to win support from young families in the GTA, having that credible plan is just paramount, because these are issues that young families discuss, and that, children from a very young age are aware now. Even in my generation, I wasn't. I'm someone who grew up in the 90s. In public school, climate change was not really something that was discussed. But I think today it very much is. It's something that comes up in the classroom at a relatively young age. And so I'm in full agreement with him on that. And it will be interesting to see what happens in the next election, because Pierre Poilievre has pledged to axe the carbon tax. And so he's certainly taking a different approach. He also cited vaccine mandate.
Hold it. Let's stay on climate change for a second.
Yeah.
My recollection may be wrong, but my sense was that there was a Conservative policy convention, and a lot of the conversation was climate change deniers and against the carbon tax. And then if it wasn't the next day, it was shortly thereafter that Erin O'Toole came out with his carbon pricing policy announcement. So not only did the caucus not get consulted, the party wasn't consulted, and it was almost completely in opposition with the sentiments of the Conservative Party. And so therefore, if you were a Liberal Party communications person in the war room, or frankly, just a person in the electorate generally, wouldn't you really wonder about whether this guy could actually carry through with these changed policies when it was sort of leader enforced from the top policy, and the balance of the party didn't sound like they actually agreed with it at all. And probably that was one of the reasons why he was ousted. So I think it was this pivot, this change that wasn't believed to be honest, truthful, and resilient, that it was going to continue because the caucus may not support him through the process, which turned out to be completely right, because the caucus ousted him, and probably the vast majority of the caucus disagreed. And I'm reminded of Patrick Brown's ouster from the Progressive Conservative Party leadership in Ontario, where maybe he's right, or some commentators are right, that Liberals had something to do with it. But most people actually think that it was progressive conservative party people that engineered his ouster, because they thought he was too progressive and wanted a more conservative leaning. And I think it was not Lynn McLeod, what's her name? That was one of the people that people have talked about as one of the key people in that regard. And so one of the challenges Conservative Party leaders have, if they want to go left or to the center, is, can they bring their caucus, can they bring their party along with them? Yeah.
And I think you're bang on the recent history on that, Brian, because I think it was March 2021, there was the Conservatives had a policy convention under Erin O'Toole's leadership. And as is the case at policy conventions, there were a myriad of policy resolutions that were put forward and either passed or failed. And I mean, this is, for those involved in politics, regardless of party, this is par for the course at party conventions. Dozens and dozens of resolutions are put forward, and the vast majority receive probably zero media attention. But this one received an extreme amount of media attention, because it was essentially, the wording was essentially recognizing that climate, I don't have the exact wording in front of me, but it was essentially a resolution recognizing that climate change was a reality, and that not only climate change was a reality in Canada, and that the federal government has a role in combating it. And I forget if it was a Quebec or perhaps a New Brunswick delegate that put forward that resolution. But a majority of delegates at the convention opposed that resolution, which is really dumbfounding when you think of it in this day and age. And that's what received a great deal of media coverage. All the headlines were around Conservative Party of Canada delegates reject motion, recognizing climate change as a reality. And then we, as you said, within a week or 2 weeks, or within a couple of weeks, Erin O'Toole rolled out this carbon pricing plan. And so it was very interesting to follow this cognitive dissonance. There was the grassroots who were clearly opposed to even endorsing a resolution recognizing the reality of climate change and the need for the federal government to address it. And yet there was the leader who did come from the Greater Toronto area, someone in their late 40s with a young family who was more progressive than the base of the party, and recognized, at least from a political point of view, that the party had to get ahead on this issue. And so I think the foreshadowing was there in March and April of 2021 that this was not going to end well.
I agree with you. Let's roll forward just for a minute here. I've interviewed some people with an organization called Conservatives for Clean Growth. I've also interviewed some people that run an organization called Centerize Conservatives. They've now changed it to Centerize Canadians. The group for Clean Growth, Conservatives for Clean Growth, started, right after the ouster during the leadership campaign, and their whole raison d'etre was that they thought that Conservatives, to be credible, needed to have a credible climate change program, and they were more, center or less right wing members of the Conservative Party, albeit people from Alberta that were involved in the oil industry, and where I think the oil industry has accepted that they have to change to adapt to a new reality, and they were trying to make their voices heard during the whole leadership process. Conservatives for Centerize Conservatives, same thing. One of their policies is that the Conservative Party had to have a reasonable policy on climate change, and really spent a fair amount of time talking about that and trying to encourage, and had a conference in Edmonton to discuss that. I met someone who had your job in communications in the Jean Charest campaign, and interviewed her last week. And she made an interesting comment. She said that the vast majority of new members of the Conservative Party were white males under the age of 40. And then I met someone else who was very involved in the trucker convoy. And she said, the trucker convoy, en masse joined up in the Conservative Party leadership campaign. I don't know if those two comments are completely accurate. And I believe that Pierre Poilievre may have motivated a lot of other people to join as well. I don't really know. But assuming that those are approximately right, that there's a whole bunch of young males not previously active in politics that were active in the trucker convoy, have joined the Conservative Party and influenced, if not, ensured the first ballot huge victory of Pierre Poilievre. Don't we think that likely is going to be meaning that the Conservative Party is going to be supportive of a climate change, if not denier, certainly not carbon tax supportive or climate pricing supportive policies? And isn't that going to be a repeat of exactly what Erin O'Toole says is a mistake?
Yeah.
Conservatives for Clean Growth say is a mistake. Centerize Conservatives say is a mistake. And what, I think you and I probably agree is that you want to win the 905, you got to accept something in regards to the reality of climate change and good policies to solve it.
So, it's a great point. The only thing I would say there, and I agree, certainly as a liberal and a pragmatic progressive, that, having a credible climate change plan, is absolutely critical for every party. And you would think the Conservatives would have learned their lesson by now. The only thing I would counter that, and I'm taking, putting aside my own views and from a political strategy point of view, is that to me, it's fascinating that even within the last year and a half, I think we're in a different place politically in this country. That is to say, I think the Trudeau Liberals are demonstrably less popular than they were even a year ago today. The public opinion polling in the last week has borne that out. We're now seeing that the Conservatives are 7 to 8 points ahead of the Liberals, which, to my knowledge, is the largest gap in probably since Trudeau has been Prime Minister. Really the last 2 or 3 years, the parties have been more or less statistically tied. We're now seeing, the Conservatives under Mr. Poilievre with a 7.8 lead. That's notable. I think the party certainly, we talk, and David Hurley, who's a notable pollster and Liberal Party strategist, talks about this. Historically, parties get bumps after electing new leaders. It doesn't always happen. Scheer and O'Toole, I think their bumps were quite modest. But I think Pierre has received a bump since taking over the party. And there was even a poll out this week showing that preferred prime minister numbers, which traditionally the incumbent usually has the advantage, even if they're somewhat unpopular. I know even Prime Minister Paul Martin was ahead of Stephen Harper on preferred prime minister until he was defeated. So incumbents are often the lead on preferred prime minister simply because they're incumbent, and a lot of people view them as prime ministerial, and they have a hard time viewing the opposition leader in that light. But I note that there's a poll out this week that shows that Mr. Poilievre is now the preferred prime minister. So I think that's one factor. The other factor I think that has changed demonstrably in the last year is the affordability crisis and 40-year record inflation. This is something that has really been intensifying probably only since January and February of this year, which was really not something that was part of the debate a year ago, and certainly not a couple years ago. And so my fear is that as the affordability crisis, consumes the public discourse, consumes what voters are thinking about, that climate change recedes as an issue. Now, is it going to recede entirely? I think there's zero chance of that because of the climate crisis. Enough Canadians see this as a critical issue, an existential issue for our country and for the globe, for that matter. But I suspect it might recede in the sense that it may not be a top issue. I think in the last 2 federal elections, it was one of the top 2 or 3 issues. I'm not sure. I mean, the next election, when that will happen, we might be in a different situation politically if it's in 2 to 3 years. But certainly right now, the polling that I'm seeing and the research I'm doing shows that the affordability crisis and cost of living is absolutely the number one issue. People are losing their homes. People are unable to afford, everyday, items like gasoline and food. And so I think that we've seen throughout the leadership race and in his first, 3 weeks as leader, that Mr. Poilievre has really zeroed in on that issue, and he's really gaining politically on that issue because the government, from a communications point of view at least, has been quite poor. And so that's how I would respond to your issue about climate change. Is right now I fear that it's receding as an issue, and that Mr. Poilievre is able to capitalize more on cost of living.
So climate change has become less of a problem in the last couple of years, regrettably, because of the pandemic, and so many of us stayed home and we didn't contribute to pollution. And a lot of those numbers say that effectively you can solve climate change by having a pandemic or a recession and slow economic activity. And that's the reality that I don't think any of us want to repeat. The affordability crisis has 2 components, maybe more, but maybe 3 components. So number one is the war in Ukraine that has caused supply problems, gas increased problems, and I think it's going to be incredibly. It's going to be a powder keg of potential problems in Europe this coming winter, and our challenges with high fuel prices are going to pale in comparison to what the UK, Germany, et cetera, are going to go through. And so I think that's going to be some front page news. And I think it's going to be interesting that we haven't helped solve the problem. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest criticisms, is that we could have done something with LNG. We could have done something in regards to helping Germany, the UK, through this fuel terrorism, gas terrorism that Putin is employing on Western Europe. Particularly if they do something to bail out of their support for Ukraine. So I think that's going to be really interesting. The second is high real estate prices. And that, I think, number one, was a cause of low interest rates, which is being currently solved. And number two, because of provincial government and particularly municipal government regulatory processes that are being somewhat solved. And I think you're going to see even more solutions to that after the municipal elections in October 24th. The Globe and Mail came out with a major editorial saying effectively municipal governments are the problem and they're not improving density. The strong mayor impact policy that Premier Ford is implementing, allowing the mayors of Ottawa and Toronto to effectively, go ahead with density increase plans for cheaper housing or more prevalent housing over the opposition of local councillors is another indication. 57 ministerial zoning orders last year in the provincial government are another. What it says is that our local government process, where local councillors are over-influenced by local residents, which may be NIMBY oriented, when we desperately need additional housing in the Greater Toronto Area for the 1.5 million extra people that are going to be moving to Toronto in the next 10 or so years, doesn't work, and we need extra housing. I think that message is slowly getting through. I don't know whether, as you and I've talked before, this affordability task force that came out with 57 or 55 recommendations last spring, and the provincial government only implemented 5 because politically some of them are pretty challenging, and you got to get past the city elections and past the provincial election before you can implement it. So I'm not sure that's going to fall on Justin Trudeau. And actually, I think the opposite is potentially going to happen, where there's a whole bunch of people that own houses that have got, $100,000, $200,000 less net worth, and are going to be upset that houses are more affordable because they lost the net worth. So, it's a teeter-totter that you can make it more affordable for everyone else. But what's going to happen is a whole bunch of the installed base are going to be pretty upset. And then I guess the last comment I'd make is, how do you solve it? Do you fire the governor of the Bank of Canada, as Pierre Poilievre has recommended? Or do you really try to help people out the way that the UK Tories have tried to help out? And that creates a financial crisis. So, inflation is high. It's got to be brought down. Interest rates are being increased to bring it down. It may lead to a recession. I don't think anyone's in favor of wage and price controls. So there's no really other way to bring the inflation rate down than solve the war in Ukraine, solve the pandemic so supply issues in China are solved, and slow the economy so that people demand less wage increases and companies can put in less price increases. And that's going to be a challenging thing. But by the time of the next election, I think we may be through that. And so people will remember it as a tough time. But affordability, hopefully 2 years from now or even a year from now, will be a lot better than it is today. And frankly, as I said, it may be the opposite, that people are saying, shoot, I like having $200,000 more in the value of my home.
Yeah. So, I have lots to say on this. I think, and this is one thing I keep on reminding people, if the supply and confidence agreement that the NDP and the Liberals forged back in March, if it endures for 2.5 years, most of these issues will not be front and center like they are today. And so it's a useful reminder. Having said that, the Liberals ought to be extremely worried around the affordability crisis and what I would argue are pretty poor communications. You mentioned the housing crisis. I think you're bang on. I've done a lot of reading on this. The housing crisis in places like Toronto and Ottawa and many cities in Ontario is due to a lack of supply. We don't have enough housing supply in this province to accommodate the immigration levels that we have. We have now over 400,000 immigrants coming into this country every year, which is historic levels. And I think Ontario brings in more immigrants to our province than any other province. And we can maybe get into this later because François Legault, newly re-elected premier, is arguing for less immigrants, whereby Doug Ford, also a centre-right premier, is actually asking the feds to have more control in the sense that he'd like to bring more immigrants into Ontario to address our widening labor shortage. But all to say, it's really the housing crisis, in my view, is mostly within the jurisdiction of the province and the municipality in terms of ending exclusionary zoning, which are policies that prevent higher density in communities, building what we call missing middle housing. So, triplexes and duplexes and having higher density. And as you correctly say, it's oftentimes local communities and NIMBY councillors who are representing the views of their communities who argue strenuously against this. And so, they say relating to neighborhood character, etc. But at the end of the day, we don't have enough housing. We don't have enough housing supply, and that's shutting out my generation from the housing market. My generation, the millennials who are in their mid-20s to mid-30s, late 30s, many of us cannot afford homes, even though we have good paying jobs and have done our, have saved money and we just don't have the privilege that our parents' generation enjoyed. My parents bought their first home, the month they were married and have been homeowners their entire life. That is not a reality for most millennials in this day and age. And so this I see as a very hot political issue that Pierre Poilievre has tapped into. He made housing a central theme in his leadership campaign, even though for the most part, it's not an issue that the federal government really has a lot of jurisdiction over. But I don't think that matters. Like his voters, his supporters, a lot of them don't realize that, but they know that they can't afford a house. They know that they can't afford gasoline. And so these issues around carbon taxing and why can't you afford a home, it really resonates with the base and with those people he was able to bring into the party. And that's what I give Pierre Poilievre credit for. He's incredibly talented at diagnosing a problem and then communicating it effectively. Never mind the solutions. The solutions aren't there, and you got at it with, firing the Bank of Canada or Bitcoin, cryptocurrency. The solutions, in my mind, are not serious. But he's so talented at identifying them and communicating them and making an emotional connection with his base to get them riled up and say, I can't afford a home, I can't afford gasoline. It's Justin Trudeau's fault. And, as a result, I'm going to, buy a membership.
But if you're talking to a small target audience of people that are members of the Conservative Party, and it's just been inflated with a couple 100,000 people that if the people I've talked to are right, they're generally white males under the age of 40 or 45, and we're supportive of the trucker convoy, if not even involved in the trucker convoy. I think that's a great policy to be talking about. But if you're talking about the general population and people between the age of 50 and 70 that are going to suffer a couple $100,000 loss in their net worth because of the same policy. Think about it. It's the same policy.
Yeah.
But making housing more affordable means that people that own homes are going to lose 20, 25% of their net worth.
And I think this becomes a generational issue, because I think where that might be an issue with 50 or 60 plus, I think what we've seen with Mr. Poilievre is he's not necessarily going after swing red Tory blue liberal votes who are of that generation. He's looking for new voters. He's tapping into younger demographics who typically don't vote. And if they do vote, they certainly haven't voted Conservative in the past, but they find themselves, economically, from a socioeconomic point of view, clearly, not where their parents were a generation ago. And so he's trying to tap into that. So if we're talking about Mr. Poilievre, I'm not sure he cares about that generation. I'm not sure that's his target.
But that's historically the typical supporter of the Conservative Party.
Right. But as I think we've discussed this in previous programs, he's trying to re-envision the Conservative coalition. He's trying to lock down the base and bring in first-time voters or young people who typically haven't voted, and he's trying to motivate them around economic.
So young voters typically don't vote in large numbers, and a lot of these people were motivated in the last year because of the pandemic, because of opposition to vaccines and masks. And some people have described them as people that were challenged because they didn't agree to vaccinate themselves or otherwise, and they were out of work. They lost jobs, and they had grievances. The polls said that 15% of Canadians supported the trucker convoy and the argument, but it was only 15%. 15% is 4.5 million people, so it's a sizable group, but it's only 15%. It's not the mainstream. So is that policy of appealing to that group going to work, particularly 2 years from now?
So I think, to his credit, and this worries me a great deal, I think Mr. Poilievre and his team are already 5 steps ahead of us on this. I think they clearly, their strategy around winning that leadership race was pretty brilliant. I mean, I don't approve of what they did, but they brought in hundreds of thousands of new members to the party around, as you just said, vaccine mandates, the truckers' convoy, this message of freedom. And he won with 68% support. He won 330 ridings out of 338. He swept Quebec, where his chief opponent was premier for a decade. And so this leadership result means that he has an iron grip on that party in terms of how he runs that party in the lead up to the next election. And so, but now I think it's been very clear from the moment he won and the victory speech that he gave on September 10th, which actually received plaudits from mainstream media and from pundits across the political spectrum. It was seen to be a very effective speech that he gave, whereby he was already pivoting. He dropped the language around COVID and back. I mean, yes, there was some freedom comments, but he quickly pivoted. And I really think that his team recognizes that in 2 or 3 years, COVID will be well in the rearview mirror. Now, these people, his supporters, he still has to throw them red meat, but he's pivoting to economic issues because the housing crisis and the affordability crisis, even if inflation cools off, as it will, that's not going to, like, inflation, right now, the price of food has gone up by 11% in the past year. That's not going to be the case a couple of years from now. But my generation will still be struggling. The problems around housing affordability for the millennial generation are so acute that inflation cooling off or a few tax credits or policies here, which the federal government are trying to implement, are not going to address it. These are structural problems that my generation just cannot afford the standard of living that our parents had. And so I think Mr. Poilievre's strategy is longer term. And I think it's really doubling down on economic issues and economic mobility. Parents always want their children to be more successful than them, but this is often not the case today. That children they go to university, they get full-time jobs, but they're unable to move up the ladder economically to buy that home, to be a homeowner. And so I think Pierre has really tapped into that. And what I want to get into, if you're willing to, is a bit around what the federal Liberal government has been saying. They announced an affordability package a couple of weeks ago around doubling the HST tax credit, some support for renters, and also their dental plan. And so I think these measures will help. But I remain convinced that the federal government is behind the 8 ball on the affordability crisis, certainly from a communications point of view and an empathy point of view, and probably from a substantive point of view, because people are struggling. And I do believe as a Liberal that part of the affordability crisis, and I've said this in the past, it's not just about prices at the pumps and prices at the grocery store. It's also about national programs that can help people. And so, yes, the government should be underlining the fact that they have a national childcare program, a program that Liberals have been talking about for 30 years. They signed agreements with every province and are implementing $10 a day childcare. That will alleviate costs for everyday families who are struggling. But that's just one piece of the puzzle. And I fear that the Liberals have, from a communications point of view, fallen back on childcare far too often. When they're asked by the media, when they're asked by their political opponents, what are you doing to address the affordability crisis, to help everyday Canadians? They far too often fall back, oh, well, we're implementing childcare.
I guess my frustration is that I think that childcare programs, pharmacare programs, HST rebate programs, they're redistribution programs, and they're going to help at the margin, but they're not going to help dramatically. And the UK government, the UK Conservative government, is the best example. If you try to fight inflation and the affordability crisis by giving people more money, by giving tax reductions, etc., what you're doing is you're doing what Keynes talked about. You're putting alcohol. You're spiking the punch bowl when you should be taking the punch bowl away. And you can see what happened to the British pound. You can see what happened to the British stock market. You can see what happened where within a week the British government had to backtrack on what they're trying to do. Regrettably, the only way you deal with this problem is by number one, higher interest rates. They're going to probably trigger a recession, or if not a recession, a mild recession and slowdown that are going to frankly discipline everyone from demanding higher wages and companies from demanding higher prices. Solve the war in Ukraine, solve the pandemic restrictions in China, and then finally, and frankly, most importantly, get more houses built, which is the supply issue that we talked about, which is going to, bring affordability more in line with what your generation demands and needs, and is justified to have. But at the same time is going to hit the older generation with a 25% reduction in net worth. And that's going to be an impact. But that's what's got to happen. And it's not easily solved. And it's not easily solved with trite things like invest in Bitcoin, fire the governor of the Bank of Canada, and or, as the British people have found out, tax cuts and help to inflation. So I think it's going to be a really challenging way to manage through. That said, I think by a year or 2 years from now, it may be solved. And so that issue may have gone away. But we'll see. Anyway, we got to take a break. We're going to take a break for some messages. I'm going to come back and I'm going to talk about gun control, because that's one of the other issues that he mentioned. Stay with us, everybody.
Great.
Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is Andrew Perez, political junkie, political commentator, political activist, political writer, and historically a liberal activist, but I think someone that's got a reasonable, objective point of view of what's going on in politics. You said the last thing that Erin O'Toole talked about was gun control. I don't think it was a huge issue during his campaign, actually. I think it was a huge issue during Andrew Scheer's campaign, the previous one. And where the Liberal Party at the time was able to paint Andrew Scheer as a supporter of guns, and the Conservative Party in opposition to gun control. And I guess my problem with where we are right now is this call for freedom, which, I think resonated with a bunch of people that joined the Conservative Party and a bunch of people that supported the trucker convoy. But I don't think is what Canada's all about. And what small L liberalism, which is what has been the success in the Western world, has been all about. Because with this call for freedom comes responsibility to be a good member of society.
Yeah.
We drive on the right-hand side of the road. We have different rules that we all abide by for the benefit of the total community. Gun control is one of those things where I think if you're, a rural individual, a Western individual, and you believe in freedom, you believe that you should have the freedom to have a gun. Is that going to resonate? It's never going to resonate in the 416, but is it going to resonate in the 905, the 705, the 519, the 613? What do you think? I think it's a real problem.
No, I think it's a deal breaker, and this has been borne out in consecutive federal elections over the last 20 years. As long as I've, been following politics, early 2000s, the Liberal Party has been able to create a wedge around gun control. And the backdrop being the US, south of the border. And we know that every Canadian, I think, regardless of political persuasion, would agree, at least I would hope the vast majority of Canadians would agree, that gun policy in the US is simply unacceptable. And so the Liberal Party has been quite effective under several leaders, going back to Mr. Chrétien, Mr. Martin, who were able to create a wedge around this issue. And you're right, in it, not only the GTA, but in urban Canada, broadly speaking, and I would probably even include cities like Calgary and Edmonton in the West in this category. These are deal breakers. And so, I think, again, the Conservative Party is caught between a rock and a hard place, because they have to throw out red meat to their base. They need to mobilize their base and demonstrate that they are authentic and they represent the views of their base, while at the same time presenting themselves as a mainstream political vehicle. And so what happened, and Mr. O'Toole didn't go into the specifics, he alluded to gun control as an issue, but what happened is, I think the Trudeau government brought in an assault rifle ban in the spring of 2020, and in the Conservative Party platform a year ago, the Conservatives under Mr. O'Toole pledged to reverse that ban. And of course, this was, I'm sure they consulted within the party, and this was a popular position. But the Liberals were able to unearth this and to make this a political issue to their advantage. And then Mr. O'Toole flip-flopped and around Labor Day announced that Conservative government would not reverse the assault rifle ban. That is to say that the Conservative government would honor the assault rifle ban that the Trudeau government had implemented. Well, what a disaster from a policy and PR public relations point of view. First of all, I think substantively their initial position was not a good one from a political point of view. And then to flip-flop, and all the headlines, highlighted that, it left mainstream voters saying, okay, you're flip-flopping, and it really angered the base. So it really, in the end of the day, he didn't please anybody. He didn't please gun supporters, and he didn't please mainstream voters, because he clearly flip-flopped when the issue became problematic. And of course, that's the worst stereotype around a politician and a leader, is someone that flip-flops on policy as soon as they realize that the policy isn't popular among some demographics. So I really do believe it was one issue of a number of issues, as we say, climate and especially vaccine mandates. So I wouldn't for a moment suggest that was the issue that lost Erin O'Toole the election, but it contributed to it, because the Liberals trotted out Bill Blair, their Minister of Public Safety. They had press conferences with images of guns. Like, they really made this a wedge issue. They highly politicized it, as they have for about 15 or 20 years now. And I'm sure it helped them win seats in places like Scarborough and Etobicoke and other suburban areas. And so we'll see how the new leader plays this issue. My free advice to Conservatives is to neutralize the issue and not make it not have a plank around reversing or changing, avoid talking about the issue, say that you'll honor the current government's policies on this issue, and try to neutralize the issue. As much as that might upset some of your base, it's going to be extremely problematic among mainstream voters. So
I agree that was an issue, but you know what? I think the bigger issue is that you used and the Liberal Party used, and frankly, the people believed the word flip-flop at the time. And they believed that on climate change, they believed that on gun control, they believed it on numerous different issues. And yet, when you describe Pierre Poilievre's speech that you said was lauded by the mainstream media, you used the word pivot. You didn't use the word flip-flop. And when does a pivot become a flip-flop? And, I think it's the same thing. It's just a different description of what you're doing. And so I think that's the risk that Pierre Poilievre faces, is that are his pivots going to be perceived by the vast majority of Canadians in the media as flip-flops, not pivots. Anyway, we're going to take a break, come back with some concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. 15 seconds. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest is Andrew Perez. He's a political commentator, author, smart guy, junkie, political junkie, etc. Andrew, I got to ask you, I think that increasing the number of people voting is one of the keys. And if you take a look at the numbers, most people think that Justin Trudeau won his first election campaign because he increased voters within young demographics and ethnic demographics dramatically. And people have done studies that said if for the same number of people and the same types of people showed up in that election as showed up in the previous election, Stephen Harper would have won and beaten Justin Trudeau. Some people think it was because of decriminalization of marijuana that motivated a whole bunch of young people to come out and vote for Justin Trudeau. I think you're right that if Pierre Poilievre keeps all these young people that were supportive of the trucker convoy motivated and they come out and vote for him, he's got a good chance. So my question is, I think there's a lot more people that are of your age or your generation that don't agree with freedom without responsibility, that don't agree with no gun control, that do think that climate change is real, and actually probably did get vaccinated and believe that COVID-19 was real. And I got to go on and say, I've met a couple of people lately within that sort of that group that joined the Conservative Party because they were motivated. And this is a terrible generalization, and it certainly doesn't apply to all of them, but a lot of them, are in that conspiracy theory rat hole. They don't believe in COVID. They don't believe in vaccines. They think it was a hoax. They think that Justin Trudeau owns patents on the vaccines and is making a whole bunch of money, and that hasn't been disclosed. They don't believe that that Russia is in the wrong. They think that the World Economic Forum is a cabal ready to take over the world. They believe in Bitcoin. On and on and on. And they think that Biden stole the election and Trump won the election. Like, they are in that conspiracy world. And if not in it, they're sympathetic with it. My question to you is, how do you motivate the rest of young people to come out and vote for something which I would deem a more reasonable proposition?
Well, I think you just articulated the central challenge that the Liberal Party faces in the next 2 to 3 years, and that is to say, to mobilize what I would argue is still a majority of the population who remain, reluctant around the vision that Mr. Poilievre has put forward. And so, how does a government that's approaching 10 years in power, that has a number of scandals and barnacles to deal with, how does a party and a government re-energize and renew itself and really capitalize on the fact that, and I think we both agree on this, that the Conservative Party leader is, even as much as he tries to pivot, outside the Canadian mainstream. And so I think it's possible, but I'll be looking for the Prime Minister and the Liberal Party more broadly to really up their communications game, to be much more effective in their communications around affordability, both in positioning but also substantively, and to be more empathetic. Like, I don't think Ms. Freeland, as the finance minister for this government, has been a very empathetic communicator. She's a brilliant journalist and writer, and she says everything she says is accurate, that inflation is a global trend and is caused by a variety of different factors. Well, absolutely. I mean, I couldn't agree more. But that's really not a communications framework to speak to everyday voters throughout the country. And so the party has really got to pick up its game. And I just want to leave your viewers and listeners with a final thought. I find it fascinating that throughout the leadership race, and to this day, Mr. Poilievre is circumventing the mainstream media. He is not granting interviews to mainstream media outlets. He even called global news reporter David Aiken, who used to be formerly with the Sun News Network chain, a liberal, for complaining that he wasn't taking questions. His first news conference after becoming leader, he didn't take any questions. He made a statement, and he's at a news conference. There's reporters there, and he refused to take their questions. And when they hector him, he calls them liberals. And so this strategy has worked for him so far. It worked in the leadership campaign. I'm skeptical to think that he can get away with being the official leader of the opposition, positioning himself to be prime minister without granting interviews to mainstream media outlets. But the media, as you well know, the media have changed remarkably in the last 15 to 20 years, and it's no longer the case that young people or even mid-aged people listen to the CBC national news or the CTV national news each night. People consume news in a variety of different ways: social media, YouTube, and this does play into conspiracy theories and communities who mobilize online and chat groups and where they get their info and how conspiracy theories are proliferated. But that's the world we live in today. And I think Mr. Poilievre is capitalizing on that. He realizes that the mainstream media is not necessarily the conduit. It's not necessarily where everyday Canadians get their news and their information. And so I'll be very interested to see how he deals with the mainstream media over the next couple of years.
False news. It worked for Trump. Maybe it'll work for Poilievre.
Yeah.
Andrew Perez, thanks for joining us. That's our show for tonight. Good night, everybody.